December 24th, 1914, Christmas Eve. On the Western Front of fighting in World War I, English and German forces were camped in trenches facing each other, surrounded by mud, death, and disease. The fighting was supposed to be over months ago, yet there still seemed to be no end in sight. Pope Benedict XV had campaigned for a diplomatic Christmas truce earlier that month, but the warring countries had vetoed the plan. But then the British troops heard a strange sound rising over the snow. Singing. Though it was suspicious, eventually the majority of the men let their guard down and joined in. At first light of Christmas morning, the British soldiers saw a few German men making their way into no man's land with their hands in the air to show they were unarmed. After a moment of wariness, English soldiers climbed out of their trenches to meet the German soldiers. They exchanged chocolate, cigars, and agreed to a diplomatic Christmas truce. Soon enough, soldiers from each of the trenches met in no man's land, celebrating Christmas, swapping stories, and burying their dead. Near the end of the day, in the distance, gunshots were heard, bringing the truce to an end. This truce allowed each side to humanize the enemy, bury the dead, and let the men in the trenches improve their conditions. The 1914 Diplomatic Christmas Truce. World War I, or the Great War, one of the deadliest conflicts that ravaged the world from 1914 to 1918. At this point in the war, everyone is frustrated at how long it is taking, each side having predicted that the fighting would only last a few months and be over before Christmas. With no end in sight as Christmas approached, on December 7th, 1914, Pope Benedict XV called for a diplomatic ceasefire so that the men in the trenches could celebrate Christmas, along with the hope that this temporary truce will give the warring nations time to compromise and end the war. Though it did have sympathy in many countries, the governments denied this plan in favor of continuing the fighting. After weeks of fighting, pushing the other side back, the battle has come to a standstill in trench warfare. The trenches are in bad conditions on both sides, with mud pooling on the ground and increasingly colder weather. Each day is spent in miserable circumstances. Then after weeks of trench warfare, it's Christmas Eve, and nobody is sure what to expect. According to one German officer, Walter Stennis, on Christmas Eve, at noon, fire ceased completely on both fronts. The noon turned to night. Many men on the English side began to make out a noise, said English soldier Private William Quinton. We were very suspicious and were discussing this strange move of the enemy when something even stranger happened. The Germans were actually singing. Not very loud, but there was no mistaking it. By most accounts, the Germans were singing the song Silent Night in the traditional German lyrics. After sitting in silence for a few songs, a few English soldiers began to sing back. As it went on, more and more joined in, though many officers and high-ranking officials stayed out, fearing to lose their position and not wanting to fraternize with the enemy. And the night continued for a while like this, with German and English soldiers exchanging Christmas carols across the trenches. It's now Christmas Day. After the singing last night, everybody is even less sure of what is happening. That's when an Englishman points out German soldiers making their way into the no man's land with their hands in the air to show they were unarmed. The English soldiers were unnerved, but they climbed out of the trenches after a few moments of hesitation to meet the Germans. Writes English soldier Frederick Davies, "They were only 50 yards away from us in the trenches. They came out, and we went to meet them. We shook hands with them." Soon, more and more soldiers on both sides of the war were coming out of the trenches, and the consensus became live and let live, or if you don't shoot us, we won't shoot you, a remarkable act of unofficial diplomacy. The soldiers served tobacco, food, photographs, and stories. They told each other of the families back home, of their lives. They took photos and lit each other cigarettes. There were small soccer games on the lines, mostly comprised of soldiers just kicking the ball around. One of the biggest legends surrounding the Christmas truce is the big soccer game. However, not much evidence seems to point to this having happened. Though there are several journals and letters that show the soldiers did play some soccer, it was mostly disorganized and just involved passing the ball around. The German government had even sent Christmas trees to the German soldiers to keep morale up, which the Germans decorated with what they had. However, it wasn't fun and games for all the men. For one, some took it as an opportunity to bury the dead, whose bodies had been rotting in the trenches or in no man's land for days or even weeks. Others used it as a chance to improve life in the trenches, improving the fortifications and clearing the mud and muck out from the floors. And then there were those who opposed the idea of the truce entirely. This was the case of one Englishman at this truce, who hated the Germans and swore to shoot any if they entered the bunker, and supposedly sulked all Christmas Day until getting into a fistfight with a German soldier. Adolf Hitler also protested against the truce, saying, "Such a thing should not happen in wartime. Have you no German sense of honor?" The commanders from both sides were displeased, as the truce was seen as fraternizing with the enemy and might dissuade the soldiers from fighting. The main thing disliked about the truce was that it exemplified the spirit of ending the war, but neither side wanted to end it. They wanted to win it. This turned a promising peace between soldiers from a beautiful moment on the battlefield into a controversial debate on the implications a Christmas truce would have. This debate ensured the warring nations would impose several restrictions to prevent another Christmas truce from occurring. Although there were several truces along the lines in 1915, these measures were mostly successful. Near the end of the day, in the distance, gunshots were fired. When the soldiers heard it, it reminded them that nothing good lasts forever, that they would soon have to go back to the trenches and keep fighting. The sides shared one last drink, and then the English and Germans shook hands one last time, ending the diplomatic truce, and returned to the trenches, unsure again of what the next day would bring. The truce just described wasn't the only one on December 24th and 25th, 1914. There were many truces along different fronts of the war, each having slightly different events occur, some running for weeks. But the core was always the same: the exchanging of memories, souvenirs, photos, food. And so were the effects on the men. On each line of the war where this occurred, men felt moved, realizing that they weren't just fighting a nameless, faceless evil, but instead real people who, based on their stories, weren't too different from them. The astounding reach of the truce is mostly thanks to German communication. Before the war, many of the Germans had jobs in London, such as waiters, which allowed them to much easier communicate the truce to the English side and keep the peace. In the end, the ceasefire was unable to influence the events of the war. It still went on for 3 more years until the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1918. However, it did give the soldiers hope and allowed them to improve their situation, to make it easier to keep fighting and live in the trenches. Today, the truce inspires many, with books, songs, and even a movie being made about it. Many of the soldiers' descendants still keep the gifts the soldiers received as a memorial to those who fought in the Great War. A statue made in honor of the Christmas truce stands proudly in Belgium to commemorate the peace amid destruction and misery. And 100 years later, in 2014, the House of Representatives passed a bill to commemorate the Christmas truce. Whereas the lessons of this event are that the light of human empathy can dispel the darkness of despair. The possibility for future peace can still exist when at war with other nations. And that behind the clashing weapons and trenches of indifference, humanity essentially endures. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the House of Representatives 1. Honors the 100th anniversary of the World War I Christmas truce of 1914. 2. Recognizes the Christmas truce's symbol of triumph of the human spirit over adversity. And 3. Commemorates the World War I Christmas truce of 1914 and its legacy as a message of future peace and unity between all nations.